St George's. I remember one of our introductory talks in the first year, and they stood up and said to us, 150 medical students, said George's had a very fine reputation at that point in time for training GPs and sexual therapists. So, not quite sure what's happened, but we chose another route. So, unless Andy, you've got something to tell me, but that looks good.
62 slides, Michael.
It's good, isn't it?
Go quickly.
You know me. Where am I supposed to stand in this process? This is good, is it? Excellent. We're so exciting. Cameras, can you see me? Excellent. It's very exciting. So I saw Paul Turner, who was speaking to you just a couple of talks before as he was leaving here. And his parting words, we said, Michael, it's amazing how much you're managing to get milk what was fundamentally a negative study. So I thought it was a bit harsh, but so I'm going to leave it to your discretion when we finish the talk, where we'll rattle through at a good pace, whether you think what he was fundamentally saying is right or fair or not. And maybe we'll come back to that when we finish. So, this is the right forum, isn't it? It was my decision to put a dedication at the start of our report for the EAT study. If you go to the Food Standards Agency website and you want to learn more about the EAT study when this talk is finished, you can download the full report, which it took me some time to write. It's well over 200 pages. But it seemed entirely appropriate to dedicate it to David and to the memory of his daughter, Sarah. I mean, it's obviously been pivotal in the anaphylaxis campaign, so of all the places I give talks, this is the most appropriate one. But I had the amazing blessing of having David on our steering committee as the lay representative. And it was no small commitment. The EAT study ran for 8 years, and so 3 times a year he would come along and spend most of a day discussing the study. And he is a remarkable man, so it felt an entirely appropriate tribute to make for him. So it is all about the EAT study. Those of you, as Andy said, who have been sort of living with your heads in the sand, you can go to our website to find out a bit more about it. And then furthermore, if you Google FSN EAT study, that will bring up the full study report and the links to the New England Journal publication. So I didn't hear what Paul was saying. I think he was talking about sort of allergy and sort of, 10 years down the line kind of things. But most of you will be aware that the EAT has taken place in the context of a series of studies around the world, all looking at the issue of whether perhaps introducing allergenic foods early into an infant's diet is potentially a good thing to do. But they divided up into studies like LEAP, where they went for a high-risk strategy, where they just gave one food, and that was obviously peanuts, through to ones which adopted a more population-based approach, where we tried to recruit the general population, as easy as that to do. And then those divided up into one study that just looked at giving egg, and then 2 that gave multiple foods. Right now, there's only one study left in the world still taking place, and it's the Prevent Adal study. This is an interesting study. It's going to be the biggest. It's 2,500 children, so it's huge. It's costing millions and millions of whatever the Nordic countries use for money. But it's also an interesting design. It's factorial, so they're doing 2 things. They're looking at the 2 current paradigms in allergy about what are felt to be most significant in terms of potentially influencing your child's risk of getting allergic disease. So one is food introduction. Anyone know what the other is? Make this interactive. Skin. So it's about doing an emollient intervention. So if you moisturize infants a lot, whether you'll protect them from getting allergies. So they're doing the 2 bits in a factorial 2x2 design. So it's going to be interesting to see what they see. We'll come on to why I think there's going to be a bit of a hiccup on the food front a bit later on. So LEAP, I mean, I cannot talk about the ugly sister, which is the LEAP and LEAP-ON studies. I feel duty-bound to give them an airing. So again, by now you must surely be familiar with the fact that this was a seismic study. I often quote Jonathan Hurricane. He said, this is probably the most important study published in the last 30 years in allergy. I think that's probably fair enough. And it was looking at high-risk children, and it was a simple premise. If you take a child between 4 and 10 months of age who's got either very bad eczema, this is properly bad eczema, or an egg allergy, or both, what happens if you either randomize them to eat peanuts a lot or to avoid it up until 5 years of age? And their first publication, the results of that comparison was published last year to huge fanfare. And then what they did, which I have to credit Gideon, I mean, it was very brave, is they asked all those children who had been eating it regularly, they asked them all to stop for a year, to see if, having seen the effect they'd had after the 5 years, whether that would be maintained through absence of consumption. And it was the paper from that, what's called the LEAP-ON study, that was published this year alongside my EAT study results. And that looked at two things. They wanted to see, first and foremost, was there still a difference between the two groups, which is what they're calling their primary endpoint. So whether you've been in the original eating group and avoiding group, was there still a difference? And then the second bit, which was a really very important question, is having told those eaters to stop for a year, had there been a consequence of asking them to stop? And so here it is, the study that can't be named. So this is their initial primary result, and it is seismic. I mean, if you were doing a cancer study or a diabetes study or something like that, to see something reducing by 80% at your intention to treat population level is just phenomenal. But that's what was seen in the LEAP study at 5 years of age, so a huge reduction in the prevalence of peanut allergy. Now, those of you who might have been present in Berlin when I did this as a pro-con debate about whether you should or shouldn't eat, I was asked to do the case. It's like all these things. They usually give the person who you'd expect to be speaking in the other group. So it was a pro-con debate as should infants introduce allergenic foods into their diet early, and I was asked to speak against. And my gentle critique of the LEAP study, and it's a real effect. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But the problem is, and I think this is pertinent to you lot, is to what extent does this extrapolate to real life? Because the LEAP study was really unusual. It was, in fact, much less real life than the EAT study, because these mums were phoned like there was no tomorrow. So up until a year of age, it was every week, then fortnightly, then monthly. And so what's interesting is if you were a 4-month-old child enrolling right at the bottom end, you would have been phoned 104 times during the course of the study to say, are you eating the peanuts? Guess what the compliance was in the LEAP study? Come on, this is interactive. Don't know what's been happening before me. Total. Complete. It was complete. I mean, they did not have, essentially, non-adherence. They all did as they were told. Depending if you give me a few beers, I'll tell you some of the conversations I heard George having with some of the more tricky mothers, which were hysterical. But anyway, let's gloss over that. So this is the issue. So as good as LEAP was, we do have this fundamental problem, and this is where we're at in allergy at the moment, is to what extent can we truly extrapolate that extraordinary finding into the real world if this is what we then say in our clinics. I'm sure Andy and I, when we're seeing little kids who've got a bit of a peanut response and we're saying, look, you need to start eating this, but we can't phone them 104 times. I mean, maybe in your private clinic, but that's different. But what about the LEAP-ON study? So, as we said, there were two aspects to this. The middle sort of figure is showing the fact, this primary outcome, the fact that difference was maintained. And it was still pretty stratospheric, 74% between the two groups, highly significant. So if you stopped eating for a year, you had this impressive difference was maintained. And in fact, if you looked on the right in the per protocol group, this is important. So this is the mothers, but you can imagine this is quite a big ask, isn't it? Look, we're talking to the Anaphylaxis campaign. Who, if you had a child who you've been so fearful they're going to get peanut allergy, they've eaten it for 5 years, they have got not a sausage of a sign of peanut allergy. You may well have been a family yourself where other people might have had issues with foods or whatever. Someone then tells you to stop. Are you going to do it? Well, being honest, I think I would have struggled. And it's heroic that mothers even claimed to have done what they were told. But they did have a spectrum of adherence. Unlike the last bit where they were all eating as good as gold, when they told them to stop, they had a spectrum of ability to stop because some just obviously felt reluctant about doing it. But if you looked at the per protocol comparisons, this is the mothers who were good as gold and did stop, it did look as if you were maintaining a healthy difference. But I think there's a really important thing here, and I've been asked after I did this pro-con debate, we've been asked to write it up for the Paediatric Allergy and Immunology as a more serious piece to raise some of the issues that both, well, particularly me, was raising. And I think this is interesting. So the prevalence of allergy in the consumption group was 3.6%, but after a year of avoidance, it had gone to 4.8%. And that is up. And that is reflecting the fact, which we'll come on to. I mean, the good news, as I said, there was a wonderful, highly statistically significant difference. But that bad news is that that increase was accounted for by 3 children who, at 5, had been shown through a challenge to be tolerating peanuts, had been asked to stop, but had developed peanut allergy during the course of that year. Now, they made the point that, there are 3 cases, but George and Gideon would say, but there were 3 cases in the control group as well. So this is 3 new cases, kids who've been avoiding peanut up until 5, who at 5 didn't appear to be peanut allergic, but 3 more still developed peanut allergy. So their argument was there's 3 in each group. There's 3 new ones in the control arm, and then 3 of the kids who were asked to stop developed an allergy. And the change from 3.6 to 4.8% is not statistically significant. But what's really interesting, and this hasn't been published, but it will when I get around to writing my Paediatric Allergy and Immunology piece. If you look at their table, it's one of their supplementary tables in the Lipon paper. What you see is that, as I said, there was a spectrum of adherence. So in the complete avoidance group, when you look at the comparison of the consumers, you've got 2.4% who developed peanut allergy. So these are the ones that we saw in the per protocol. They've been good as gold, 2.4%. What about the mums who ate a bit of peanut, but they were allowed to eat a little bit and still be considered per protocol? What was their rate of allergy in their kids? That was 1.6%. What about the third group of mothers who thought, this sounds a bit of a nonsense, I'm going to keep eating it? What was their rate of peanut allergy? And they didn't have a single child. And if you put that into graphical form, and I had to pep this up for the pro-con debate a tiny little bit, so slightly fruity footnotes. But it's interesting, isn't it? Did as you were told, 2.6%, bit naughty ate a bit, just under 2%, completely ignored the advice, not a single child had a peanut allergy. And I think it raises an interesting thing, which comes back to the real world, because LEAP is so not real world. But in the real world, if you've got a kid who's eaten peanut to 5 and it's been successful, do you think if you really turn around to the mother and said, do you know what, you can stop it now for a year, and we've shown that it's all right, who's going to stop? Would you stop? I wouldn't stop. And then when I see my kids in clinic, I say to them that we're starting you on this journey, and you should view this now as something you do for the rest of your life, as far as we know. A bit like Andy with his desensitization. We know when you desensitize, you can't stop. So it's a disaster. They'll come bouncing back with their allergy. So I think, as I said, this was my concluding statement. Now, you could argue this isn't a bad thing. But in the context of the anaphylaxis campaign, we are talking about, and this is again something that Jonathan Hurrain has pushed quite hard, is that we're potentially talking about quite a seismic change in the way we're feeding children. If we're saying that, potentially this is something you need to eat on a sustained, regular, ongoing basis. You could say, is that good? Is that bad? So eat. What about eat? Much better study, twice the size. So we were looking at multiple foods. We were looking at younger children. Those of you who aren't familiar, so we enrolled 3-month-old infants, and we randomized them to introduce 6 foods rather than just 1. And we followed them up until 3 years of age. But the key intervention period really was up until 6 months of age. And then we saw how many became allergic or tolerant. And why do we do it? Why start at 3 months? A lot of mothers get really sort of bit palpitations thinking that sounds horrendously early. But we know that the current situation in the UK is that mothers aren't big fans of giving allergenic foods into their diet. They're fearful, surprisingly fearful. 43% said they were concerned about allergies. These are unselected normal mothers from the general population. And fear about allergy predominates, but also fear for egg, about food poisoning, things like that. But remarkably high. And you look for nuts, 33% concerned about harm. So this is way, way, way in excess of the true number of people that have a peanut allergy. And of course, this has a great big influence because, as I've shown many times before, the end result is that when you look at the infant feeding survey data, the diet of an 8 to 10-month-old, certainly back in 2010 when this was published, was really very deficient in terms of having any regular peanut consumption. You can see that at the bottom row, kids are eating it on a sort of daily basis, less than 1%. Kids who are less than once a week or never, 99%. But it's not just peanut. If you look for fish, even fish, 3 times a week or more. Remember, LEAP was about giving peanut 3 times a week. That's 1 in 5. Eggs, 6% are having eggs 3 times a week. Well, you might say that's a lot of times, but less than once a week or never, 76%. So here we go. Standard group was asked to follow the UK infant feeding guidelines. No early introduction of any of the allergenic foods before 6 months. After 6 months, to be absolutely clear, it was entirely at a mother's discretion whether she wanted to give the foods to her child or not. Whereas the early introduction group were asked to introduce these foods early. And remember, this is all set in the context of kids who were exclusively breastfeeding at the time of enrollment. They'd had nothing else whatsoever. What were we asking them to give? People are sometimes, not quite clear how much we were asking them to try and achieve. It was essentially 4 grams of food protein a week. And what does that equate to? It's about 40, 60 grams of yogurt, 3 rounded teaspoons of peanut butter, so 1.5 each time. Same for tahini. About a hard-boiled egg, so about half an egg twice a week. Quite a lot of Weetabix for a 4-month-old baby. A lot of the mothers looked at that and said, "Are you serious?" That's a whole Weetabix. But anyway, that's what we were asking them to give. So it was a big ask. This is quite hard to see. It's the CONSORT figure. Actually, it projects a bit better up there. What we were able to achieve through blood, sweat, and tears was, a very good retention rate. We had over 90% of our mothers coming back at the end of the study. We had over 95% of the mothers at the end of the study filling out the last questionnaire. What is now, I'm sure you're all familiar with, was that we had this rather stark difference between the proportion in the two groups that were able to keep up with being what we'd asked them to do in terms of being per protocol. So in the standard group, who were asked to exclusively breastfeed and not introduce foods early, mums did very well. This is 80.5% of the whole cohort, so of the whole group. Whereas in the in the early introduction group, the figure was lamentably smaller. So if you take it as the whole lot, this is including ones that dropped along the wayside. In fact, we don't know whether they complied or not. It was only 1 in 3. So, but what was the results? Here is our magnificent article, my transient moment of glory. And what you see is that, I think there's a few take-home messages here. So green is the early introduction group. The intention to treat analysis is on the left. You can see it is reduced. That's the first thing to say, is at an intention to treat level, it is reduced. It's not statistically significant, but it's interesting. It's not the same, and it's not higher. But it's not statistically significant, just let me emphasize that. But what we did see, and this is where I gently take issue, because as an epidemiologist, I'm a bit of a passionate believer that I think a negative randomized controlled trial, a true negative randomized controlled trial, is one where in the intention to treat analysis, which is, remember, where you analyze them regardless of which group they go, regardless of whether they did it or not, is negative. But a truly negative study in my book is one where in the per protocol analysis as well, it's negative. But in other words, you're saying that regardless of whether the mothers did it or not, it didn't make any difference. But if the mothers did do it, it still didn't make any difference. That tells you what you're trying to do doesn't make any difference. That's not the case of EAT. In EAT, at the intention to treat level, it's lower, but it's not statistically significant. But if you did it, boy, did it work. It worked remarkably well. And this is at the overall level. We'll come on to the adjusted analysis. 20% non-significant reduction in the intention to treat, but a 2/3 reduction in the per protocol. And what was interesting is that the food-specific level is just how much more dramatic the effects were. Peanut actually proved to be one of the foods that was significantly easier to eat than some of the others, say, for example, egg. So we actually had quite a decent number. You can see that the per protocol analysis for peanut, you see it's 835 compared to, this is in the middle, compared to 740, showing the fact that far more mothers in the early introduction group managed peanut all right. If a mother did as we had asked for the peanut, and it was a decent number of mothers, we did not have a single case of peanut allergy. at all, zip, nada. And you can see for egg that you still are also getting quite a dramatic reduction. So 100% reduction, 75% reduction. So what are the conclusions? This is the line that after a fair amount of negotiation is what we came up with in the, when am I finishing? I've got loads of time, gosh. 15. Oh, this is on a roll. So this is after a lot of negotiation with the New England Journal, was the punch final paragraph for the paper. So the study failed to show efficacy in an intention to treat analysis. Further analysis suggests that the possibility of food allergy prevention through the early introduction of multiple allergen foods in normal breastfed infants may depend on adherence, i.e. doing it, and dosage, i.e. how much you give. And I think, for me, that was a fair concluding paragraph. So in other words, as opposed to a, say, let's call it a double negative study, this was negative intention to treat, but positive per protocol. Now there's a massive issue when you have a study that shows that, which is that you have got to consider the possibility about biases. So in the New England Journal, we went to great lengths. I'm not sure many people read it, but it's long. So the supplementary appendix in the New England Journal paper runs to almost 100 pages. It's got, I think, about 40 tables and 40 figures. So if you really want to understand the study, you can go the whole hog and read the Food Standards Agency report. But if you read that supplementary appendix, that will give you a really clear picture. We postulated that there were 4 interpretations of what we'd found. The first was, we said, it works. You give foods, you stop food allergy developing. What would be the argument for saying that was true? And the argument was, sorry, we'll come back to that. The second one was to say, okay, that's not the issue. This is all about reverse causality. And that would be the most common criticism that would be made. And reverse causality basically is saying that if you introduce the foods into the mother's diet, the mother starts giving it to a child starts getting symptoms. Therefore, the mother stops giving the foods during that key period. That child will, by definition, become non-per protocol. They won't have done it at the level they are supposed to have done it. And they are the ones that are going to become allergic and be designated food allergic. So in a sense, what we found, you could argue, is that, well, of course that's the case, because in your per protocol group, you're sort of cleaning out the non-allergic children. The mothers who could do it had kids that weren't having problems, so they look fantastic. Whereas the non-adherent ones, the mothers who couldn't do it, that's where all the allergy is going to be. So we'll come on to that. The issue of bias is important because we did have attrition in the study through the 3 years. Even though, as I said, we retained a large number of the mothers, we did get mothers dropping out at different stages. And in general, we got more mothers dropping out in the early introduction group than the standard group at the different stages. And we'll come on to whether that was a problem. And the final one, which is important, which I'll do very briefly at the end, is that the study design meant that there were some kids who were allergic at baseline in the early introduction group, so they're the ones being asked to eat it, who obviously, by the very definition of the study, couldn't become adherent. Because if you had an egg allergy when you came through the door, we're hardly going to go and say, keep eating eggs. So by definition, they could no longer eat egg. So they went into the non-adherent group. So in a sense, slightly biasing the study against what we were trying to do at the outset. But that was an inevitable product of the design of the study. So what about the first one? Could it be true? Well, what's the reasons that it's plausible? A really big take-home for EAT, and Leap has shown this as well in a sort of more tangential way, is that the food introduction protective effect seems to be food-specific. You want to stop your kid getting peanut allergy, you feed them peanut. You want to stop them getting an egg allergy, you give them egg. Leap has shown very nicely, you want to stop a kid getting tree nut allergy, giving them peanuts makes no difference. Which is a bit of a pain, actually, because there's a lot of tree nuts. So we're faced with a slightly difficult predicament of how many foods can you realistically get a kid to eat on a sustained, regular basis to try and ensure they're safe. But in supporting that is exactly what we found, is that at a food-specific level, if you gave the specific food, the protective effect seemed to be greater. And then we had a really important thing, is that we did not have the infrastructure to phone our mothers 104 times. Who knows how much the LEAP study cost? Very quiet. Well over 10 million quid. So this is a lot of money for a study. We were funded initially at a quarter of that for a study twice the size. We could not phone our mothers. So our mothers were much more left to their own devices. So when you see that 31%, which is of the whole group, it's actually 42% of the ones we know whether they did or not. There's some we just don't know because they dropped out. But even so, 42%. So what's that reflection about? Well, it's because we couldn't cajole them. And the big argument is, would that be the percentage you would see in the real world if you extrapolated this out into generic, this is what people should do? And that's a bit of a subject to debate. The great advantage we had, though, was that because we had a broad spectrum of adherence, that allowed us to do something that LEAP could not do. And namely, that's we could do a dose-response relationship. And this is, in fact, the figure that the New England Journal statistician was most happy with. He liked this one. But it basically was showing that we did indeed see a dose-response relationship. Essentially, the more the mother was able to eat towards our target of the 4 grams per week, the more successful it was in reducing the sensitization and the allergy in a child. It also meant we could actually set a level which seemed to suggest if you ate this amount, you were okay. And what was fascinating, I think the most interesting finding, is that what started all this research was the work that Gideon and George had done looking at Israeli children who have no peanut allergy, who introduced this peanut snack called Bamba early into their diets. And subsequently, Adam Fox got involved, and they looked at how much the Israeli infants seemed to be eating. And roughly, it works out as an average of about 2 grams per week. And this is all in observational work, just doing questionnaires. It turns out when we did our dose-response relationship, if you ate 2 grams a week, you didn't get peanut allergy. So it's the identical amount. How much does 2 grams a week comes up to what I said? That's a teaspoon and a half. I really passionately believe if you give your kid a teaspoon and a half of peanut butter early enough and keep giving it, they won't get peanut allergy. I remain to be knocked down on that one. What about reverse causality? And so this is what I was saying before. The issue, and it's a really serious one, if they didn't follow the protocol, it may have been done because they had low-level symptoms, aversive, refusing, even before they had really obvious things. And then ultimately that may have led to sort of food refusal, and that those are the kids that were going to get the food allergy. And as I said, this is going to artificially shift. You get a clean group who could do it because they weren't getting symptoms, and a dirty group who couldn't do it because they were getting the ones with early symptoms. And in fact, I was lucky enough to be invited out to Australia this summer to the Australian Allergy Conference, and one of the 3 letters that was published in the New England Journal after our paper was by the very person that invited me out, Katie Allen. And she was making the point of exactly this. She's saying, isn't this the issue? Isn't it just that you're siphoning off the good, healthy ones? And that all your sort of, all the allergy ones are being turfed into the ones who can't possibly do it because they were getting symptoms. And that's what she's basically saying. And she's saying this because she's saying that you've already shown in your supplementary appendix, and boy, did they read the paper properly, that you're saying that infants who did report symptoms were more likely to be non-adherent. And this is the table she was alluding to, table S14. And it's the penultimate row at the bottom. It was showing that statistically significantly, if a mother reported symptoms to the early introduction foods, she was less likely to adhere. So you'd say, well, that seems to fit. That seems to make sense. So we're seeing that mums who are reporting symptoms less likely to adhere. But I said to you, there's a sequelae. That only works if those kids were indeed the ones that then went on to have more allergy. Then I'd buy it. I'd say, yep, this is reverse causality, this is a problem. But the problem was, let's look. This is the per protocol comparison. We've seen this in the first figure I showed, the New England Journal. So this is our sort of 70-odd% reduction, statistically significant. But this is the per protocol group. So what about the non-per protocol group? So remember, what we're saying is that Katie Allen is saying the difference between the height of those 2 peaks is explained because that amount has all been shifted across to your early introduction group, non-adherent groups. So if this was true, really you should expect that amount of height to have been added on to the non-adherent early introduction group. And what did we see? Completely the same. So there's not a hint there that it's been swelled by the ranks of the allergic infants being kicked across Now you might say, but there's a third group, Dr. Perkin, because we've got the per protocol, the non-per protocol, but some didn't do enough questionnaires or they dropped out a bit along the study, and maybe it's because they all went into that lot. So it's your kids who dropped along the wayside are the ones where the allergy lies. And so even these two groups have been distorted. But we can look at the outcome for virtually all of those. And that's them. So in fact, the SIG group is so small that you can't really read too much into it. It's only 31 kids. But there's enough, 81 in the early introduction group, to be confident that that's about the right figure. And what I think is beautiful about that is that it's providing no credence to the idea that there are these kids that are being turfed into these other groups. And in fact, when you looked at it by food, we'll go over this quickly, but the same thing applied for there's no convincing evidence that the same pattern was happening for any of the specific food adherence as well. And in fact, what we showed, as I said, in terms of the compliance issue, is rather beautifully, is that if we had people look at it, and as I said, at the level we set our adherence rate, it was 43%. It's a bit sort of involved, but what's important to see here is that if we'd been more generous, maybe instead of saying they had to eat 5 foods, because what we said to them is by 6 months they had to have eaten 5 or more of the 6 foods for 5 or more weeks at 3/4 of the amount we asked. And if they did that, it turned out 43% of our mothers did it. Now, if Gideon and I, when we sat down there, and to be honest, we kind of made this up on the back of a fag packet, but if we had put a bit more thought into it, the reality is we could have said, let's not be so harsh. Let's say that a mother did a really good job if she gave at least half the foods for at least half the amount for at least 4 weeks. 4 weeks seems a reasonable amount of time before 6 months. Now, if you do that, we go to our top left cell, and then, in fact, we would have come up with saying 81% of British mothers managed to do it, which sounds remarkably better than 43%. But you could say, well, we were being too generous. We should go really full Monty and go to the bottom right, and, of course, the figures go proportionally down. What is really interesting, though, is what happens if you look at the allergy rates in all these groups. Now, remember, you've got to set this against the allergy rate in the control group, which was 7.3%. So remember the figure 7.3%. And what you see is for virtually every single permutation in the table, there is a statistically significant reduction. Not surprisingly, when you're going to the bottom right, you would expect there to be no allergy. If a mother could give all these foods in bucket loads for loads of weeks, of course her kid's not going to have an allergy. But interestingly, even if you go to the most generous one, the one that 80% of the mothers see, you're still seeing a roughly halving of the allergy rate, which I think is rather interesting. So, and that's a graphical representation. And this is another one that we put forward as suggesting that there is a dose-response relationship. Because what you see there, I think quite nicely, is that as you go across in those different dimensions, the more foods you eat, for the longer, in the high amounts, the more you see a reduction in allergy. So, but there was a second part, which was quite an interesting one to Katie Allen. She did a two-parter. She squeezed it in. And that was saying that we had only given information about how successfully the kids ate the allergenic foods up until 6 months. And she said maybe the issue, maybe the reason that EAT didn't work is that because you were doing this study where the onus was so obviously on introducing the foods early, maybe, particularly for food like peanut, the mothers in the standard group did as they were told, didn't give any before 6 months, but the moment they got to 6 months, they started piling it in like there was no tomorrow. So the fact you're not seeing such massive differences is because the two groups weren't that different after all. And so when I went out to Australia, specifically for her, I did an analysis looking at the two groups to see what was the average frequency of consumption between the two groups at the different times. And if you look at the right-hand figure, you can see the black solid bars showing the median frequency of consumption in the early introduction group. And from 5 months onwards, you can see at 4 months they're just kicking in, but from 5 months onwards, that median frequency of consumption in the early introduction group remained twice a week, which is what we were asking them to do throughout the whole period. And if you look at the standard introduction group in contrast, for 4, 5 and 6 months, when we knew we'd already published that they weren't giving any, but you see that there's no hint at all that on any kind of systematic basis that it's really cranking up either. This is a bit more tricky to see. Of course, egg being a more common food to introduce, egg was starting to appear. It's hard to see this, but in fact, the differences between the two groups are more subtle, but interestingly, at each time point, they are statistically significant. But they are definitely getting much closer, which is kind of what you'd expect for egg anyway. So what about bias? As I said, we had these rather low percentages at the bottom, and we have 3 points where we had attrition. So at the top end, we have kids who didn't complete the study. And these are the ones where it's tricky because you might think we don't know enough about them to say, did they have any problems at all? But we have a second group, which is ones who did complete the study, but didn't do enough questionnaires for us to know for sure whether they were per protocol or not. And then the final group is the ones where we do know that they were non-per protocol, which we've already talked about before. So looking at the ones that drop out, because you might say, okay, the kids that drop out, maybe EAT had tons of early introduction groups that were very allergic. We've shown very beautifully that ethnicity was a real issue in EAT, and it was in LEAP as well. And if you're not aware already, you should be, but the rates of allergy are vastly higher in general than the ethnic minority groups, than the Caucasian population. And so it was a little bit worrying when we saw that the mothers who were more likely to drop out in the EAT study, for both groups in fact, were much more likely to be non-white. They were much more likely to drop out. But what's interesting is you might say, well, that's a bad thing, because that's going to be where all your allergic kids are. But in fact, interestingly, enough stayed in until a year that we could look at their skin prick, their eczema rates at a year. And interestingly, you can see there that in fact their eczema rates were a bit lower, 21%. Conversely, and again you say, oh, that's a bit worrying, their skin prick positivity rates were a bit higher, 25%. So you think, oh, that's getting near a p-value, so that looks a bit worrying. What was fascinating was the ones who came back in a year, most of them did have challenges to define their allergic status then and there. And what's really telling is that we did not have a single case of food allergy in these kids that subsequently dropped out by 1 year of age. And by 1 year of age, you can see comparison to that in the, remember, the final rate of allergy was 7.3%. So 4.7, 3/4 of the allergies already emerged by a year of age. So the fact we didn't have a single case of allergy in the kids that dropped out really doesn't provide much evidence to suggest that we had a wave of very allergic kids. Yes, they were more non-white. Yes, they were more sensitized, but we know from LEAP that is the case for non-Caucasian children. But there's no evidence they have more allergy. What about these two groups, the non-evaluables and the ones who weren't per protocol? Again, interestingly, ethnicity was important. If you look at the ethnicity, third row down, in the standard group, the ones who adherence we couldn't tell were more likely to be non-white. And in fact, going across in the early introduction group from 7.2% being non-white in the per protocol group is a real stepwise. 16% were non-per protocol, and then the ones who we couldn't tell because they hadn't done enough questionnaires was 23.6%. So a bit of a big issue. And in fact, we made the comment that if you're going to roll this out, there's going to have to be a real focus on what we do with the non-Caucasian population to try and ensure they're facilitated in doing what we're asking them to do. There's a really interesting one is that at the bottom there in the blue panel there, we showed that the ones who didn't, adherence was non-evaluable, these are the ones that were dropped out, had poorer maternal quality of life scores at baseline. This is before we'd asked them to do anything. And that's quite interesting from a point of view of designing a trial, because you sort of almost wonder, these were mothers, I suspect, who were biting off more than they could chew. They wanted to help us, but their scores were telling us, do you know what, you're not going to manage this. Which I think is quite interesting that those differences were there already. But as I said, we can look at the food allergy outcome. That is the figure we've seen before. And we know that these racial differences, these quality of life differences, don't account for the differences between the two groups. And then finally, as I skip towards the end, we did have a series of baseline allergic kids. And this is really important. There were 7 children in the EAT study who had baseline positive challenges. These are children who had never had a whiff of solid food or cow's milk. This has just been breastfed when they came through the door. And this is really important, because what this is telling you is even if everyone in the EAT study had done exactly what they were told, we were not going to cure food allergy. And in fact, if you work it out, 7 groups of 650 each group, it's about 1%. So there would still be 1% of food allergy. You're not born food allergic. If you skin prick test a newborn baby, you do IgE test, they're negative. So a process then entails to get to the point where these children all skin prick test positive. They would not have been positive at birth. The massive debate, though, you genetically may well be predisposed to become allergic. You may be genetically predisposed to get lots of eczema. The big debate, therefore, is maybe we weren't early enough. Who's up for giving their baby solids at 2 months? And that's the debate, because what people are now saying is maybe it doesn't have to be solids. What if you gave a peanut powder in your, to mix in with your express breast milk, or to mix in with your formula? Because remember, there's no formula-fed babies in EAT, so I can't say anything about formula. But maybe that's what we have to do. And of course, this was the issue, because these kids, of course, could not comply. They couldn't comply because we'd told them not to eat the food because they're allergic, and that's obvious. So in a sense, those are stacked slightly against us, but we did take that into account. So that's what the figure is on the right, where we made an adjustment to try and take into account that in the early group we had these 5 kids. So we thought the fair comparison was, when we're comparing the 2 groups against each other, was to kick the same number of kids out of the standard group. So we're comparing like with like. But you still got a significant p-value in the per protocol analysis. So always with these things, you have to have that little proviso statement saying that we can't be certain. We think we tried really hard to look to see whether this was a biased comparison, but we fundamentally came to the conclusion that ultimately we felt that number 1 probably is the most convincing answer. Was the study any good? It's the largest one published to date, as I said. We did double-blind challenges. We set every single kid that had a positive skin prick test, we challenged. I mean, that's phenomenal. You know, even if they were eating it, we challenged them still just to confirm that we could see. Mum's got so fed up with us. You know, say, my child eats Weetabix every week. I say, sorry, you got a 1 millimeter response. We're going to supervise giving a Weetabix so we know, and we can say for sure your child is tolerant. Is it real world? I think it is more real world than LEAP. Because we couldn't chase them up. So what mothers achieved, I think, is more an accurate reflection. Did we give too many foods? I think undoubtedly. I think we gave too many foods. Mums reported time and again that their kids hated things like tahini. Who's eaten tahini? You must be vegetarian. It's disgusting. It's very bitter. You know, hummus is fine, but to get the same amount of protein in as hummus, it's at 3-month-old. You're giving them a tub of hummus. You know, they're having to bathe in the stuff, so it just wasn't tenable. But perhaps if we'd given less foods, I might be sitting here with my positive and being even more famous. Are the kids representative? Gloss over this. We've looked pretty hard and shown that they are. Can we extrapolate to the high-risk population? We let anyone come in through the door who asked to participate. No one was chucked out. But the fact is, ours were a more general population, and it's interesting to note that only 9 of our kids in the EAT study would have been eligible to participate in LEAP based on their eczema status. But remember, they were much younger. And of course, what we don't know is maybe some of them, if they'd been given enough time to get towards the 4 to 10 months, which LEAP allowed, whether they'd become more allergic. There's a really key one here, because people are talking about how do we enact this. And what's really important, that bottom bit there, is the fact that 3/4 of the standard group did not have eczema at 3 months, but they still contributed 40% of the kids with food allergy. So if you devise a national system where you just focus on the eczema-looking kids, we're going to miss a lot of food allergy. Take-home message, I think, happy to be shot down. I think EAT works, if you do it. There are table upon table upon table you can look at, but there didn't seem to be any convincing evidence that it increases the risk of food allergy if you don't manage to achieve it to the level that we ask you to. And as I said, there's table upon table that shows you that it was safe. We did not have a single case of anaphylaxis reported through the process of introducing the foods into the kids' diet. There is so much more to come out of EAT. It is an astoundingly rich and detailed and varied study. We had our mothers hoovering the floor, posting in poo through the post, filling out more questionnaires than you can shake a stick at. They come from throughout the country, so we have a massive geographical spectrum that we can look at. We've got blood samples coming out the woodwork. We tested all the parents for their sensitization status as well. So is EAT the new food revolution? Well, I'll let you decide. But I'll close with the words for the editorial that accompanied our paper in the New England Journal. This is by Gary Wong. So feed your children and hope that they will eat. Thank you very much. This is my lovely team.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. Really excellent overview of the study. So you talked about high risk and low risk in the study, but just get it down to brass tacks for the audience. Which population exactly are you advising that people follow this advice for?
So that's a really good question. So the Australians, having just been out there, the Australians have been the first country to break ranks and produce new infant feeding guidelines. And you can argue whether they've gone for fudge, but they have gone for saying that you should introduce your child to solids at between 4 and 6 months of age. So that's breaching the sacred grail of 6 months. And they said that by 1 year of age, your child should be consuming the allergenic foods. The huge debate is that prescriptive enough? Because we know from LEAP, and LEAP have got some beautiful stuff coming out about the fact that within their 4 to 10 month spectrum of admittedly high-risk kids, the kids were getting more and more high risk as they went through. So I always use the analogy when I'm talking about Andy. Where's this going? That, especially EAT, is about trying to stop the horse from bolting. Because it is much harder after the horse has bolted to try and bring it back into the stable, which is the work that Andy has done. So the question is, I think that front-ending it probably is important. And I say to my mums, really, that at the time you are introducing allergenic foods into your child's diet, and the debate is that will the government move to 4 to 6 months, and I think it will. But I would argue that at the time the child is introducing allergenic foods, introducing solid foods into their diet, allergenic foods should be part of that. There shouldn't be a sequelae that comes further down the line. And my take-home message to mothers in clinic is I say, unless there is a reason for your child not to be eating the allergenic foods, I think your child should be eating the allergenic foods. Why? How does someone know they haven't got a peanut allergy? They eat peanut. Simple as that. Your kid eats a food regularly and no obvious symptoms entail, they ain't got an allergy. And there's no point doing any testing whatsoever.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Any questions? Yes.
Just going on from that, most of Europe recommend feeding children between 4 and 6 months. I think the UK is just about the only country that says wait to 6 months. So do we see more allergy in this country than the other countries in Europe?
It's interesting. It's a bit of the sort of things I challenge my mothers for is the veracity of statements, because that's not true. Because every European country signed up to the UN WHO guidelines, which say that you should aim for 6 months exclusive breastfeeding. Every European government signed up to that. And the big debate is to whether that was too much a one-size-fits-all policy, saying that every mother should exclusively breastfeed to 6 months. How many British mothers exclusively breastfeed to 6 months? We've hit the almighty target of 1%. 2%. It's a big bad one at the moment. A lot of people think the problem was they went for one-size-fits-all policy. And of course, Jonathan Hurrain has made the very pertinent point, is saying, is what we are suggesting, though, going the other way, is that a one-size-fits-all policy? In a country that doesn't have a strong heritage of tons of peanut allergy, is it right to be saying, do you know what, you should all be giving a kid peanut early on? And I think maybe we're going to have to get away from the idea that there is a universal thing that should be done to all infants when it comes to feeding. And there's going to have to be a little bit context-specific in terms of country-specific issues.
Okay, thank you, Michael. I think we better wrap up there. Great talk. Thank you.